Welcome to you all to this Pathways Forum on different pathways approaches. For this discussion, I'm very grateful to our great panel speakers that are with us today, and would like to welcome Andreas Mayer, Sandra Lavorel, Bruno Locatelli, Niki Frantzeskaki, and Adrian Ely. Some of you might remember that Adrian also participated in our very first Pathways Forum back in 2021. Welcome back, Adrian. And also a special thanks to Mark Stafford-Smith, who could not be here today, but he's a member of the Pathways Initiative steering group. And he's been very helpful and instrumental in the design and development of this session. So thanks to you, Mark. In a way, the topic of our session today directly came from the name of our initiative, the Pathways Initiative, and the question that often follows when we talk about it. People will often say, okay, that sounds interesting, but remind me, what do you mean by pathways exactly? And this is not an easy question to answer, or at least there's not a single answer. Generally speaking, we could say that pathways are ways to reflect and question possible futures, futures that are more or less plausible or more or less desirable, and also to assess the conditions and often the transformations that are needed in order to get there to those futures. In practice, though, there are different research approaches that tackle this question of possible futures with variations in the geographical or temporal scales that they examine, in the types of systems that they study, in the ways different actors are involved in the development of pathways, and in the leverage points that these approaches seek to mobilize in order to foster transformative change. So today, thanks to our speakers, we'll be exploring and discussing 4 approaches: quantitative scenarios and modeling, transformative pathways, adaptation pathways, and transition management for sustainability transitions. And for each of these, we will see the differences between them and the types of questions they seek to address and how they seek to address those questions, but also the points of overlap and complementarity between these approaches in trying to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. Just before we start, to give you a general overview of the program for today's session, in the first part, we'll be looking at presentations from our speakers on the different approaches that they use in their work. And in the second part, we will engage in an open discussion where we will be able to address more transversal questions and topics, and where all of you will be invited to contribute with questions and comments. And with this, I would like to invite our first speaker, Andreas Mayer, to take the floor for a presentation on quantitative scenarios and modeling. And please do not hesitate to use the chat for questions and comments during the presentation, and we will use them during the open discussion at the end. Andreas, whenever you're ready.
Thanks. I just try to share my screen. Okay, welcome to my presentation on quantitative systems modeling of future scenarios from co-creation to quantification. My name is Andreas Mayer, and I'm a senior scientist at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, BOKU, here in Vienna. So I was asked to talk about models and scenarios today. And I would like to start with an overview and show that the toolbox of approaches for systems modeling for sustainable scenarios is large. There are many different approaches, and all have their strengths and their weaknesses, and all are fitted to specific analytical purposes and research questions. So you can see here a figure from a publication that is under preparation from my colleague, where we listed 9 different modeling traditions, and we classified them along 2 axes: monetary or biophysical consistency, and whether the approaches are static or dynamic. We here focus on one specific approach for systems modeling that is based on material and energy flow analysis, and you can see it in the upper right corner. So before we start our discussion on systems models for scenario assessment, it's good to share some definitions. First, a system is a set of physical entities or parameters that interact and are observable where the entities can be a specified quantity of matter or a volume in space. Systems do require inputs, transform them into outputs, wanted and probably also unwanted outputs. Second, a model then is a summary of features of a real system and a specification of the relationship between these features. Since a model can, and also should, never include all the features of a real system, a model is an abstraction of a real system. The definition of a system, or specifically a model of it, can be done under close interaction with stakeholders in the definition of inputs, the definition of the model of the system itself, and the interpretation and analysis of outputs. Third, a scenario is a description of what could possibly happen under given assumptions and constraints. So scenarios are open in terms of where to go and how to reach. They can help to understand the implications of large uncertainties of the future developments of, for example, the global agri-food and land use system. And this is the area where I'm working in. Scenarios should also embrace a wide range of possibilities and should be prepared to expect the unexpected. And last but not least, if the scenarios are developed cleverly, they can help to answer what-if questions. So one specific condition to mention are system boundaries. To have clear system boundaries, relevant factors and dynamics need to be defined, either by researchers alone or in close collaboration with stakeholders. This will then also determine what you can see and what you can't see. There are a plethora of scenario studies, and I would like to share some reflections of scenarios on future agri-food and land use systems that we have developed in our group here in Vienna. We did this with a biomass balance model by using a specific approach which we call diagnostic. Diagnostic means that we can ask questions from a what-if perspective. You can see the resulting publication on the right. So we were asking, can agricultural supply meet demand under exogenous assumptions on crop and livestock systems, and also by considering additional constraints, for example, on land use change? The BioBAM GHG.2 model, where you can see a schematic illustration of the scope of this model on the right side of your screen, was developed to model the feasibility and the ecological impacts from future agri-food and land use systems from the regional to the global level. In our thinking about scenarios, each scenario is based on exogenous trajectories for demand, which is a crucial difference to economic modeling, and scenario-specific restrictions on or limitations to land use change. So the system's parameters and variants or future trajectories, those parameters might develop were either developed on a drawing board based on our researchers' knowledge and assumptions of important system features and trajectories. And you can see the resulting publications here. Or they were based to reach certain defined targets. So for example, net zero GHG emissions in the agricultural and in the land use sector. Or the system parameters and goals were co-created with stakeholders. I here share a great quote about the process of co-creation from a wonderful publication on the future of urban food production and consumption in the city of Vienna. So the quote reads, "Actors from the broader society are aware of socio-political issues and have specific local knowledge and experience that scientists often lack. Thus, the co-production of knowledge between science and non-science is particularly useful for analyzing context-specific solutions to complex socially relevant problems. So for example, environmental sustainability, and promises to result in more robust socioeconomic, political, and technical solutions that are socially accepted and better adapted to the particular context." I would now like to present an example of a study where we went all the way from the definition of consistent scenario narratives to modeling the biophysical and economic implications of those scenarios in close collaboration with stakeholders. So we started off with the question, which environmental impacts does have the territorial adoption of sustainable and agroecological practices of the EU's agri-food system? And then we asked stakeholders across regional case studies in the EU 2 questions. First, which agroecological practices do you want to highlight from your case study? And second, how could the EU agri-food system develop until the year 2050? The thinking about the future development was structured along two development dimensions: the level of regionalization of the agri-food system and the level of agroecology. During the whole process that took 2.5 years, we tried to keep a high level of co-creation with constant information flows at both directions, including many feedback loops. This has proven to be essential to keep good progress, high participation, and a good acceptance of the whole process. We then reached at 5 scenarios in the end, where we then modeled the environmental implications with the BioBAM model. The scenarios were based on a common understanding of the EU agri-food system and main influencing parameters. Of course, the stakeholders and the researchers had to make quite some curtailments during the process. Some reflections from that will come in the end of my presentation. So for each scenario, we assumed some demand side trajectories that are that the EU citizens adopt sustainable human diets, and that ruminant livestock is fed with an increasing share of grassland feed instead of concentrate feeds. We additionally assumed reduced EU exports, so EU biomass and food exports, that translates into lower levels of production in the EU. On the supply side, we assumed a reduced utilization intensity on grasslands, a better integration of livestock and agricultural land, as well as reduced cropland yields and more ecological corridors. The resulting scenario, which we named local agroecological food systems, was then assessed in its performance for environmental impacts against the EU Green Deal goals, as well as we calculated price changes and taxation that will help to move towards such a scenario. You can see here the storylines that we developed, and you can also see the results from this scenario mapped against EU Green Deal goals, as well as against the other scenarios that we have developed. The upside of such a scenario approach is that this allows for the apprehension of very detailed scenario narratives and qualifications. However, the downside is that in the end, there is a very specific scenario, one very specific scenario, which is highly uncertain to happen because it is based on so many assumptions. So problems that we encountered were the developed scenarios are based rather on rather narrow imaginations or only comprise what would be nice to happen. In such a process, it's also hard to think out of the box. Scenarios consist of rich and detailed storylines, but the models, of course, were limited and abstract. And last but not least, there are often problems with the definition of an appropriate baseline. So during the stakeholder process, we often ended in extensive discussions such as, will parameter X develop according to trajectory A or rather like trajectory B? And will that have a large impact on, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, or can you neglect the impact of such changes? So we therefore used the specific approach that we developed to embed the scenarios in a broader, or how we call it, in the option space. So for example, we thought, what would happen if in this specific scenario, human diets would consist of more ruminant products? So you see here that this then becomes another scenario. Or what if only crop yields would develop differently? Again, this is also a new scenario. So here you can see all combinations of all parameter variants that we included in our model. With such an approach, you can ask many what-if questions. So I just want to mention that a variant can also be a low or a high estimation of a parameter with uncertain data. So for example, how crop yields would develop. This helps to understand the impact of the uncertainty of this parameter. And this is very similar to a sensitivity analysis. And you can then show, for example, the greenhouse gas implications of all scenarios that are possible if all system parameter variants are combined with each other. So this here is what you see is the option space of the future agri-food and land use system in the EU, based on all defined system parameters and variants. I certainly agree that such a scenario approach deviates from those of consistent narratives and storylines. This was also not very straightforward to communicate to fellow researchers, but also to stakeholders. And to end my presentation, I would like to share some reflections on this process. First, I think it's central to have a clear imagination of how defined or how open the process is. If this is not clear to you, you are likely to end up with having constant negotiations rather than being able to work on a common problem definition and on co-creation. The second point is that there might be mismatches in the spatial and temporal relevance between the modelers, the researchers, and the stakeholders. Further, it's also likely that there are language differences. And here I mean that modelers communicate in a very formal language because they need specific numbers for specific processes. Stakeholders, such as farmers, do think and talk in different terms about the same problems, probably. Translation is essential here, and it's also a source for many errors and misunderstandings. Further, I also think that it's crucial that modelers are open about their assumptions, as well as how they cope with uncertainty and how they communicate uncertainty. In relation to the specific approach that we used, this option space is not straightforward to understand, mostly because the scenarios are only defined by combinations of biophysically possible system parameters, but not by desirability or likeliness. The scenarios that we have developed are not consistent narratives, and this is very distinct to the common view of what a scenario is. So communicating this was very challenging, but also very instructive for ourselves. It also helped very much to keep a constant flow of information and to allow for feedback loops between the researchers and the stakeholders. And it's also very important to take responsibility as a researcher. This is, I think, very important if, for example, the results are unpopular or if the results are perceived as a threat to some stakeholders. So to sum up, this question came up quite often during the process of using quantitative biophysical models in processes of co-creation. And this was a good thing because it constantly forced us to reflect on the process. So asking the question, how open can you be and how open should you be? So some concluding remarks. We learned a lot about agri-food systems and the general levers towards sustainability. So typical levers that we, and often in such studies, the levers that are found are, for example, less meat consumption and production and the reduction of food waste, among others. However, with our approach, we did not get insights on how to get there. So, for example, which pathway to choose, gradual or immediate change, or the degree of inclusion of specific actors, and so on. Second, the second point is something that system models do in general neglect, and this is the role of decision-making and human agency. And third, questions of power that are central for enabling change were not addressed at all in our model. And with this, thank you very much for listening and hand over back to you, Gilles.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this great presentation and very interesting reflections on the process that you used. I'm just going to warn everyone that we're going to be saving questions until the discussion part. But in the meantime, whenever you have any questions for any of the speakers, feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll save them and use them during the discussion part. So thanks again, Andreas. With this, I suggest we go to our next presentation from Adrian Ely this time on transformative pathways. Go ahead, Adrian, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Gilles. I'm assuming that this is displaying correctly.
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's really great to be joining this discussion because I think that these kinds of debates, which uncover the differences and also the synergies between different approaches to pathways and studying pathways to sustainability and acting on pathways to sustainability are really important. So thank you, Gilles and colleagues, for organizing. I'm going to be talking today primarily about a transformative knowledge network that I co-led with my colleague Annabelle Marin as part of the work of the STEPS Center. STEPS stands for Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability. And we undertook this work with a broad range of organizations whose logos you can see there at the bottom of the page. Across the globe, and very much this was a process of learning about walking different pathways, understanding the world in different ways, and trying to work together and learn from those differences and synergies. I in no way am able to summarize everything that we did, but I would like to just recognize the other academic colleagues that fed into this work. These are a subset because we very much worked across academia and also with various other stakeholders. The publicity for this event talks about pathways becoming a buzzword, and I think it's fair to say that it has become a buzzword. I also want to start with a definition, just like the previous speaker, and my one goes back to 2007, shortly after the STEP Centre was initiated. This defined pathways as the particular directions in which interacting social, technological, and environmental systems co-evolve over time. This was the paper that my colleagues put together that really set the foundation for the subsequent 15 years of work that the STEP Centre has been engaged in. Thinking at that time about what differentiated the STEP Centre's approach to pathways, or the STEP Centre's pathways approach to other approaches, I think we can point towards this notion of evolutionary change and the importance of especially evolutionary understandings of technological change and dynamics such as lock-in, path dependence, but also beyond that understanding of technology, the various different drivers of change. That includes social drivers. It also includes environmental change interacting with technological change. And I think that that was relatively new at the time. It was very different from the modeling that we've just heard about, very qualitative, drawing on science and technology studies, history of technology, and also development studies. And with those kinds of disciplinary backgrounds, we also highlighted the uncertainties involved in those co-evolutionary dynamics, co-evolutionary patterns of change. Now, we heard about uncertainty in modeling. Absolutely. With a focus on power and the role of power in sustainability challenges, and in particular, the role of power in shaping unsustainable pathways, we used the STEP Centre's pathways approach to really highlight the hidden uncertainties and assumptions that were often put forward in dominant narratives, not necessarily the ones that were came out of formal assessments, modeling or other types of assessment, but the narratives that were put forward by dominant actors that were actually shaping pathways into the future that served their own interests. So we recognized complexity, we recognized uncertainties, and we also recognized the way that different actors view change and pathways on the basis of their own situated understanding. And this notion of framings came up a lot in our work. I think we've been asked to talk about problems that our pathways approaches address. We've been asked to talk about some of the barriers that they face and some of the responses. So I'll go on to those. And I think that as an analytical approach, the pathways approach that the STEP Centre has used really addressed this problem of powerful interests and powerful actors shaping narratives, shaping knowledge politics, so that solutions to sustainability could actually serve their own interests, but also occlude and obstruct other kinds of contributions to sustainability, the ones that may be favoured by and contributed by more marginalised communities. So this we saw as a problem, and in areas of energy and climate change, water and sanitation, urban development, agriculture, health, and medicine, we've used this pathways approach to identify how dominant narratives can actually serve to obstruct otherwise useful contributions to sustainable outcomes. And those might be technological solutions, they might be innovations that come from the grassroots rather than from formal science, technology, and innovation systems, or they might be contributions that are much more social in terms of new ways of working together, business models, NGOs, networks, new social innovations. But I think in responding to the question about barriers to this approach and also responses, we go from the analytical to the action-oriented agenda of the pathways approach. We recognize the dominant narratives and the dominant unsustainable pathways, and in an action-oriented vein, we actually try to challenge those, holding them to account, pointing towards inconsistencies or inaccuracies, or indeed instances where powerful actors draw selectively on scientific knowledge in order to bolster their own position. And beyond that, obviously a barrier is those entrenched powerful interests. Beyond challenging those interests, we also work across networks to try to enable transformative change. So that means working with communities, and there's various different types of communities, to try and empower them with knowledge or through other contributions, so that they can actually seek out, define, and enact their own pathways to sustainability. And it was in our transformative knowledge network that we really took this challenge forward, working not only with colleagues in Europe, but in various others across the world, the logos of which I mentioned before. But just to give you a very brief overview of the work, we worked across 3 different domains, and in each of those domains, we had paired hubs in the north and the south that were actually trying to learn from each other's experiences. Here in the UK and also in Argentina, our colleagues at the Centre for Research on Transformation, we all worked on food and agriculture, agri-food systems for sustainability, with an interest in land and also in seed systems and intellectual property. Our colleagues in Mexico and the USA and India worked on challenges around cities and also water, primarily in urban and peri-urban regions of either Mexico City or Delhi, the national capital region, Delhi. And our colleagues in Kenya and also in China worked on clean, inclusive development in terms of transitions towards low carbon energy systems and modern electricity systems. So in Kenya, this was a study on distributed solar. And in China, we were really looking at the justice implications of closing down carbon intensive and polluting industry. Each of these challenges, the sustainability challenges, were locally defined. So we didn't come in with an overarching picture. We worked with colleagues who co-designed those challenges and those projects with partners in their own localities. And the project itself, which ran over 5 years and overran beyond that time, really focused on how we could learn from each other in applying the pathways approach, but also adapting it, building upon it, critiquing it, and learning about when and how it was actually useful. So you may ask, how did we work across such a diverse range of domains and also geographical regions? And I think that's a very valid question. We were lucky in that many of our colleagues had worked with the STEP Centre previously, and we were able to draw upon the notion of pathways that I mentioned before, but also various other concepts which we called theoretical anchors, which had been defined either in the 2007 working paper that I mentioned, or in this book, Dynamic Sustainabilities, which came out in 2010. We adopted a notion of systems which was similar to the one we heard of before, but actually brought in social change and forefronted that to a greater extent. And we were really explicit about framings of the system. We heard about system boundaries before, but beyond system boundaries, we instilled across the network the idea of reflecting on what needed to be sustained, for whom and by whom. And so querying that from the beginning when defining our sustainability challenges. Those theoretical anchors were combined with what we could call a methodological anchor. And this was an approach called transformation laboratories. It's really a process, it's defined here, so I'll just read it out. A process involving research and transdisciplinary engagement to address a complex sustainability problem or challenge. Now, this is very flexible, and that was on purpose. We played around with the definition. We experimented with the notion of transformation laboratories or T-labs, and we came to find that in each of the contexts we were working in, they could be combined with different types of research methods. They could bring together different kinds of disciplinary researchers, but also actors. But at their core was this strategic and guided transdisciplinary process to research, experiment, evaluate, and learn about pathways to sustainability. So in each of our 6 hubs, T-lab processes ran in parallel, involving co-produced research, experimenting with different social innovations, in some cases technological innovations, and reflecting within the hubs and with the different partners that our research colleagues were working with. But then across the network, we also sought to learn from each other's experiences. And we were able, pre-COVID, very, very fortunately, to come together at 3 points at international conferences in order to learn from each other's experiences, exchange our knowledge and the lessons learned, and reflect upon theories of change, which we defined at the beginning, but which evolved as we went through the work of the network. Also reflect upon the interactions between research and action, and also reflect upon this process of learning itself. So a lot of our work was dedicated towards how to organize internationally networked research initiatives so that the learning process itself can be enhanced. It was an extremely rich experience, and we all learned a great deal from it. And some of that learning is codified in this book, which is an open access book. I wonder if Gilles or one of the colleagues could share the link in the chat. That would be really useful. In here, we outlined the theoretical and methodological anchors I've discussed, but also each of the hubs gave an account of how they'd applied them and how they decided not to apply them in their different contexts. So we drew out the lessons from each of the hubs, but also from across the different hubs in terms of lessons for future internationally networked transdisciplinary research. But beyond this and countless papers and so-called knowledge outputs, I think that some of the most valuable outputs that emerged from the work were the networks, mutual understanding across these very different disciplines and cultural contexts, the lessons from ongoing experiments. So one of the initiatives that emerged from this was an open access seed platform that our colleagues in Argentina developed called BioLeft. That experiment continues, and we're continuing to learn from it. After the lifetime of the project itself, we also embarked upon a process of further reflection and self-criticism, which was led by colleagues in the US and in India, which enabled us to continue learning and basically critiquing what we would have done, what we did well, what we did badly, and how we would have done it differently in the future. And as I said, there were new initiatives and extended partnerships that actually evolved from the project itself, especially those led by our colleagues in Kenya and in Mexico. So the pathways approach here was very much a process of learning, recognizing different ways to walk pathways, different epistemic and theoretical foundations for understanding pathways, and acting in different contexts to actually bring them to reality. Yes, I'd encourage you to take a look at the book if you're interested in learning more. One thing that we drew from our work and expanded upon in the book is this notion of different approaches to transformation. And my contribution was billed as transformative pathways. That's the concept that we tried to outline in the book. I think what is key is that we didn't come up with one notion of what a transformative pathway looks like across the world. I think that academic ambitions and incentive structures would probably suggest that that would have been the best way to go, but we actually recognized that transformative pathways means different things in different circumstances. But we did draw upon what we call 3 different approaches to transformations: structural approaches to understanding transformations primarily from a political economic perspective, systemic approaches which draw upon socio-technical systems and also social ecological systems, 2 very important bodies of theory and empiric knowledge. We drew upon in the different hubs both of those kinds of approaches, but I think what we really introduced and majored on is what we called enabling approaches, which were really about focusing on building individual and community capacity, transformative capacity, to manage uncertainty, to act collectively, and to pursue positive pathways to sustainability. This graphic is taken from a leaflet that the International Science Council produced on the basis of this paper by Ian Scoons and various colleagues across the network. They also recognized some of the limitations, and so this doesn't necessarily come from our paper, but whilst seeing these enabling approaches as recognizing human values and the potential for collective action, the enabling approaches also address power dynamics and social injustice. The ISC also suggested that there were weaknesses that, or at least limitations, that these approaches might neglect structural and political obstacles. Fair enough, I'm not sure about neglecting, but those remain an obstacle, as I mentioned before. The other limitation here is that the ISC suggests enabling approaches may burden the most vulnerable with the task of transition. And I think I'd contest that. We wouldn't burden marginalized communities with the task of transition. We would challenge powerful interests to lead on transition first, but enabling approaches work with more vulnerable communities as allies in trying to bring about transformations that serve them as well as wider society. So that's a very brief and rapid overview of our work, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other presentations and continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And while you were speaking, some people have shared the link to your book in the chat. So for anyone interested in the Transformative Pathways to Sustainability book, it's on open access, correct? So anyone can download it, just clicking on the links that have been provided in the chat. Thanks again, Adrian. For our next presentation on the adaptation pathways approach, we have not 1, but 2 speakers. I'm very happy to invite Sandra Lavorel and Bruno Locatelli to take the floor. I think, Bruno, maybe you will start whenever you're ready.
So thank you very much, Gilles, and the whole Future Earth team for organizing this webinar. My name is Bruno Locatelli. I'm an environmental scientist at Cirad and the University of Montpellier in France. Today with Sandra Lavorel, we are going to talk about pathways of adaptation to climate change. And first of all, following Adrian, sorry. Yeah, first of all, following Adrian and Andreas in the previous presentations, I would like to start with a definition of what we mean by adaptation pathways. So these adaptation pathways are generally defined as sequences of actions to adapt to climate change. Here, the keywords are adapt, of course, but also actions, because actions are central to the pathway thinking. These actions can be implemented progressively, depending on future dynamics, which leads to often representing adaptation pathways, as you can see on the slide. So in this plot, we have adaptation pathways represented along an horizontal axis that represents time or a changing climate, for instance, temperature increase or sea level rise. And there are a few important features in adaptation pathways that I'm going to show in this slide. So first, pathways are often normative in the sense that some pathways are preferred to others, which is sometimes represented with a vertical axis that shows a goal, such as adaptive capacity or resilience. Then, adaptation pathways recognize agency, or the capacity to act or to push the system towards a preferred pathway. So we talk also about bifurcation, where agency play a role to define where the system goes. Then the sequence of decision over time reflect path dependency, given that one decision at one point of time depends on what has been decided before. And finally, when we think of pathway, we also recognize that uncertainties are everywhere, and we need adaptive management along the pathways. Having said that, and having defined what we mean by adaptation pathways, I would like to present the three main outcomes that we expect from an adaptation pathways approach. According to a paper published by Siska Werners 2 years ago, there are three main outcomes that we can expect from adaptation pathway approaches. The first one is to respond to specific adaptation needs. The second one is to foster collaboration among stakeholders to facilitate learning and build capacities. And the third one is about using pathways to stimulate imagination about possible transformation. So in the next slide, I'm going to present the three approaches associated with these three outcomes, and I will give an example for each one. So for the approaches aiming to respond to specific adaptation needs, these approaches are often called performance threshold approaches, and they are characterized by the fact that very often in those approaches, there is only one goal. This goal is clear, uncontested, and quantifiable. For example, there is only one performance metric about like water availability or reduction of flood damage, which correspond to one set of values. So all stakeholders share the values that this goal are important. So in this case also, there are very often clear mandates and agencies of some stakeholders to implement in adaptation. For example, a governmental organization in charge of flood protection. In these approaches, the methods are generally based on modeling. They are often data rich. They use engineering type of knowledge, and they produce route maps and decision support. For example, what we see on the right part of the slide. So I'm going to give an example of this approach, an example from the Rhine Delta in the Netherlands, a work developed by Asnoot and colleagues. So as you can see in the picture on the left, the case is about an engineering system where dams play an important role for flood regulation and water storage in the lakes, which are key aspects for climate change adaptation. The figure on the right shows different adaptation actions from the bottom to the top. At the bottom, it's more on the water demand, on the top, more on the water supply side of adaptation. And these actions are connected through pathways that are represented as almost as a subway line in a subway map. And these actions are connected also through transfer station, where there can be a change from one pathway to the other. Those transfer stations are particularly present when there is a tipping point ahead in the pathway. A tipping point is represented here as a vertical black line. So the second outcome I presented before is about collaborating to learn and build capacity. This approach is often applied in very different contexts from the ones of the first type of approach. In this context are characterized by the absence of consensus on the goals of adaptation, particularly because there are multiple values and interests at stake, and also multiple knowledge systems. For instance, local and traditional ecological knowledge. The process in this case is clearly participatory, and the outputs are less important than the process itself. The process is the one leading to the collaborative learning, and the outputs, for example, the visualization of stakeholder-built pathway, is not as important as the learning along the process. An example of this approach is the work done by James Butler and Russell Wise in the Solomon Islands. They organized many participatory activities to build adaptation pathways, including workshops where they discussed visions of a desired future, but also other possible future, perhaps less desired. And also the strategies for adaptation, and they combine all of this by building pathways of decisions and action. So the output was a representation of pathways, as you can see on the picture, but the outcome was a collective learning on adaptation. Now I would like to leave it to Sandra to continue presenting on the third type of approaches, the one on imagining possible transformation.
Thanks, Bruno, and I'll tell you when to go to the next slide. So the third type of outcomes is focuses on imagining possible transformations through these pathways approaches. And its distinctive characteristic is that it's really about transformation in cases where, unlike in particular the first approach and the first outcomes, there isn't a clear agreement that the current system is okay, nor are its projected trajectories. So in this case, pathway is used at least as a metaphor regarding the broad directions of changes that are potential, feasible, and some of them not so desired. And that's to attain a number of strategic aims, which are the priorities of the visions of the participating stakeholders. And the aim also of this approach is to actually reveal visions that weren't obvious from the start. So it's really about overcoming some of the limitations that we heard about from Andreas in his first presentation about not being imaginative enough. These approaches have a focus on the system and especially the interactions between social and ecological adaptation, and are asking which values and governance will foster adaptation and transformation. And therefore, the focus here is on the drivers of change and also the barriers which then turned into levers for change. So now I'm going to give an example. And I'm going to describe how this proceeds. So here, as highlighted by Bruno in his first definition slide, the focus is really on the agency at some bifurcation points, which we call windows of agency. And these are analyzed in order to diagnose and understand with stakeholders what happens when the socio-ecological system comes to a point where change is considered necessary, either due to external drivers, for example, biophysical tipping points or external crises, or due to internal crises. So the focus of the analysis is about these decision points, how the decisions are made, which are their constraints and levers in terms of interacting values, institutions, and knowledge, and how changes in the decision context, in case it is not favorable, can create new opportunities. Next slide. So now I'll turn to an example of work that we carried out in the French Alps, where here, as a first step, based on a synthesis of up to 15 years of work at this site, including some fieldwork, some modeling studies, some in-depth understanding with stakeholders of their values about the system, as well as the study of a particular crisis due to an extreme event. We were able to synthesize this knowledge as a pathway described according to 4 caricatures of potential futures and routes to these. So in this representation, we focus on these marker decision moments, as well as the windows of agency where actors mobilize changes in, for instance, values and institutions and different forms of knowledge to bifurcate towards a different model system configuration. Next slide, please. However, the approach that I just described was very much researcher-driven, although the work itself was fully participative. And so here and in other studies, the current trend is often to hybridize these different approaches. And as in all classifications, in fact, all approaches and outcomes aren't clearly separate when you go to real case studies. I'm going to now illustrate briefly how this took place in the same Alps case study. Next slide, please, Bruno. Where we actually hybridized the transformative pathways approach with a co-creation approach and a capability building approach, where here we built on all the prior knowledge, so fairly systematic knowledge built by the researchers, to conduct an in-depth participatory process where stakeholders identified their adaptation objectives, making up a coherent vision for their area. And then the levers for the implementation of nature-based adaptation were identified through a series of board games in which people from the local area took part. And this allowed us to identify a key set of levers for adaptation, which in fact are very consistent with levers found, barriers and levers found elsewhere, to do with collaboration networks, changes in the institutions and the underpinning value system, empowerment of local actors, the importance of social innovation, but also how this then spreads through the system and can result in those changes in governance, and also the key blocking role of path dependencies. Next slide, please. So from this quick overview of adaptation pathway approaches and their intended outcomes, we can conclude that overall adaptation pathways appear as a very powerful metaphor to work with stakeholders and decision makers by creating narratives and visualizing pathways and learning collaboratively. So, and although the three approaches that were depicted have different shades of these, they all often have some of these components. What's important about these approaches is that they create opportunities for transformation by their focus on agencies, and they bring together stakeholders that hold multiple values, goals, and knowledge to deal with the symptoms rather than to deal with symptoms, but most importantly, with the root causes of vulnerability. These approaches, of course, aren't perfect. They also have some challenges along with their benefits. In all the cases that we presented, the research and the engagement processes are time intensive, as is often transdisciplinary research. Although they clearly and deliberately try to stimulate imagination, there are often limits to what can be achieved in practice with stakeholders. Even though some changes might be desirable from an outcome perspective, there are issues with acceptability of change. Common with many other transdisciplinary processes, there are also clear issues with procedural and representation equity. And even though processes are more and more careful about this, you only can achieve what is possible on the ground. Overall, we'd like to emphasize as a final point that in our experience, and we believe that of many other colleagues, and that was just emphasized by Adrian as well, in the end, these approaches aren't delivering recipes for transformation and do not support technocratic approaches to transformation, but really are about building capabilities of those who participate, individuals and collectives. So with this, I'll thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you, Bruno, for this great overview of the theory of change behind adaptation pathways. And for our next presentation, I would like to invite Niki Frantzeskaki to talk to us about transition management in the context of sustainability transitions. Niki, whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. Let me first share my screen. Good afternoon from me. My name is Niki Frantzeskaki. I'm a professor in urban and metropolitan planning and governance with Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And thank you all for being today in the webinar. Thanks also the organizers. And I want with my presentation to actually add to what already the previous panelists have presented, and especially Bruno, Locatelli and Sandra Lavorel, who very nicely presented an overview, not only of how we can think about pathways, but the different methodological, theoretical and epistemological attributes that these pathways have, especially in relation to how we can use them, how we can think of them, and how we can employ them through co-creation process for dealing with climate adaptation. There is also where is my starting point. I look mostly and have done mostly research in urban environments, and I find a lot of the things I'm going to present today relate mostly about urban transition and transformation pathways. In an earlier Future Earth project, we produced a book called The Urban Planet, and one of our key messages for future research and future urban practice was that if we are to secure a better urban future, we must produce an integrated and actionable urban knowledge. Taking this as a starting point, I want to position the research on pathways that we did with transition management approaches, with knowledge co-production methodologies and approaches into why do we care? Why do we talk about pathways overall? It's because we want to find and we want to devise new tools, new approaches, and also new metaphors or narrative devices to coordinate knowledges, imaginations, actions, and solutions to deal with urging climate and biodiversity crisis. My starting points, apart from that, of we doing it so as to co-produce actionable knowledge, is I build from sustainability transitions research as well as sustainability science. My open proposition is I conceptualize and always take in transdisciplinary research pathways as strategic planning tools. And why is this important to put in the forefront is because in sustainability transitions, studies and research, we have seen also research on pathways that they takes a historical perspective, looking on the past so as to understand path dependencies, pervasive institutions, and look on why things don't change. I'm coming from a different school of thought within the sustainability transitions field, that I look on pathways as forward-looking, action-oriented, actionable knowledge products. Also, a third starting point is that, as you already saw with the panel today, there are multiple understandings about what a pathway is, what constitutes a pathway. There are multiple methods to co-create pathways, and there's also a plurality of knowledges, solutions, institutions, cultural meanings, values, imaginaries, visions that can be associated with pathways. Therefore, we always use it in the plural form as well, conceptually, theoretically, epistemologically, as well as analytically. I start with three things to take away from my presentation. First, that we talk a lot about transformative visions. We have also embarked into the era that we talk a lot about transformative missions, missions-oriented research, mission-oriented innovation, mission-oriented policy. But also, if you see on the missions framework of Mazzucato, also the notion of pathways is also featuring very prominently. Both visions and missions, they require coordinated actions to be achieved, or a coordinated device to mobilize action and imagination for individuals as well as collectively. The second key message of today is that if we are to look on what transformative action we need to take on the short term, on the medium and the long term, that requires a narrative device to coordinate these actions over time. And this, of course, brings me to the definition in terms of how pathways are conceptualized and understood, especially coming from the transition management research and approaches, as progressive courses of actions to achieve a collectively defined vision. But at the same time, if we look at it from a strategic planning perspective, pathways can also be used and devised to think, to dialogue, to examine how to break path dependencies, how to transform the context in which different solutions can create alternative developmental pathways, developmental routes. And at the same time, pathways have been used to examine, to create dialogues, to create collaborative thinking and collaborative action as well, to create positive path dependencies. In this context, we also recognize that time and agency are really connected. The third takeaway message is that, as we have seen from the global reports from IPBES all the way to the recently published IPCC report, complex problems and the combined climate change and biodiversity crisis, they require multi-actor collaborations in order to be dealt with. Pathways, therefore, offer a way to examine, understand, even problematize, not about the action only, but who is the solution, and also the politics of it. Whose solutions are prioritized, whose solutions are represented, and for whom positive outcomes of these pathways are to be distributed, when and why. So pathways are not apolitical. This is one more dimension when we talk about the governance and the politics of pathways to sustainability, resilience, and climate change adaptation. In a publication, you might recognize that we all depict pathways with very similar visuals. And in our visual, building from resilience, sustainability science, and sustainability transitions thinking together collaboratively, we also defined the difference between desirable pathways and undesirable pathways. At the same time, also of directed transformation and emerging transformations. When we are taking complexity seriously, we need to always think that there are multiple pathways. They operate in ever-changing contexts, and they are immense feedback loops to actions and courses of actions that they take off. These are to show that the complexity is inherent to the context in which we think, we imagine, we strategize about pathways, but at the same time, we need to keep being adaptive in the way we manage, rethink, re-examine these pathways from a governance and planning perspective. Very much in line to what the presentation of Bruno, Locatelli, and Sandra Lavorel presented earlier. And we saw this that indeed, when you look on different ways of how to co-create pathways, how to create these multi-actor collaborations and dialogues and examinations of current actions, future actions for dealing with climate adaptation. These processes of co-creation and co-production are rather time-intense and time-demanding. They require transdisciplinary methodologies, agility in terms of facilitation, but also the researchers in the process have a very serious role to play into not only in the input knowledge, but also into systematizing and synthesizing the knowledges that are being brought together in these co-creation processes. The images are from the Impressions project, a 5-year-long co-production, 4 different regions in Europe with cross-case workshops documented. And what you see with the blue post-its is just the co-creation of one long-term pathway of dealing with the nexus of food, water, energy pathways to deal with high-end climate change in the region of Hungary. From this participatory work, we also saw that it's not only the pathways working in isolation. Pathways demonstrate the multitude of actions needed for a more sustainable future, but are also not separated from, they shape and they are shaped by the social, cultural, political, and institutional context in which they operate. That makes some solutions valid alternatives to roll out within pathways in one context, but not in another. So when we look on transformative solutions as we identified as positive tipping points that can really alter exactly this institutional context to new system configurations, we need to look at them as entangled with the different pathways already emerging, as well as directed. And when we talk about directed pathways, we talk about the role of planning, of policy, and of different forms of strategic management and strategic planning in the context of climate change. But for these solutions and pathways to take off and to materialize, to be realized over a period of time, we realize that this depends also on the different capacities in terms of transformation, adaptation, resilience, takeoff, as well as the capacities of different actors to mobilize different forms of capitals for these pathways and solutions, to find their way into an agenda and to find also their way into becoming a reality. And we talk a lot about the importance of coordinated action and the importance of pathways for strategic planning in order to break path dependencies and also create positive path dependencies through solution empowerment and solutions rollout. In another example, with the city of Antwerp here, the notion on pathway was taken more to the local level. In the picture is not only what you see, but also who you do not see. And this co-creation process was initiated by citizen groups, a citizen group and the city of Antwerp, and not from researchers. So this co-creation process was entirely organized, run, and consolidated and synthesized purely from a city society partnership. We see that more and more, especially in the local environment. In cities and in urban planning contexts, we see that this co-creation of pathways, co-production of knowledge is happening for climate adaptation using pathways as analytical devices, but also as strategic planning tools, with researchers, with scientists being just one of the partners in this co-creation process. And that is definitely not only happening in Europe or in US, but also in across the globe. We see the notion of pathways, the aspects of more co-creative approaches being more and more prominent, not only as research, transdisciplinary research methodologies, but also for strategic planning at a national level. From a recent work during my period in Australia, we examined what would be possible urban policy and urban planning pathways in order to institutionalize further and roll out the nature's national strategy of Australia to the Australian cities and regions to create and to achieve nature positive urban futures. As you might recognize, this is just one of the many dialogue papers and co-creation outcomes of this national deliberation and national environmental science and policy collaboration project that is still running. One of the pathways is exactly pointing to the aspect of collaborative planning to empower communities and, of course, to build an evidence-based planning for nature in cities by looking not only of expert knowledge, but also of local and indigenous knowledges. Something that comes very much in line to very many assessments and pathways papers that they come across other continents as well. That wraps up into looking more closely not only on how and what would be methodologies, approaches for building pathways, but also within pathways that have been co-created, the need to remain inclusive, collaborative, and to ensure a plurality of values, visions, and understandings of what a sustainable, inclusive future is really pivotal. And the last message and some inputs of where it builds from is that we need to always ask, and pathways offer a way to examine, understand, problematize, reconstruct and deconstruct about who is the solution and whose solutions are prioritized, depicted, represented in pathways. Looking and making some input from how transformative pathways and transformative capacities can play together and can inform each other as analytical and conceptual devices by looking on what makes transformative, what are the transformative capacities of low carbon urban innovations. We found from a massive systemic literature review of more than 500 records that in terms of the strategic and participatory planning, the most important elements and the most important characteristics that they build transformative capacities that are important for enacting, mobilizing, activating transformative pathways for sustainable cities are to go practically, if I can summarize it, is to look more closely at what your communities are doing. Create institutional spaces for including communities at a grassroots level, or build networks through urban experimentation, and also on looking on the transformative actions and abilities and capabilities of different groups. See what's there, how they can be transformative seeds of innovation and of sustainable solutions, and then let those become the solutions that drive transformative pathways. And with this, I want to say that even though we do problematize a lot and we are very aware of our positionalities as researchers, of how we co-create, the role we play in co-creation and in knowledge co-production with other social stakeholders in order to generate, question, examine transformation pathways, science and scientists, we have a major role to play in transformative change. And I invite in this way, of course, not only more comments and more discussions, but also early career researchers to really embark in more transdisciplinary research on pathways with a focus not just for the science, but also for science for society, for more actionable knowledge to deal with our emerging and rather urgent combined crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niki, for this great presentation that concludes the first part of our session. And I think everyone, or several people, are eager to start engaging in a more open discussion. I can see that there are already some questions that have started appearing in the chat. And so I would like to for this part of the session, to please invite absolutely anyone who wants to take the floor, to raise their hands in order to ask questions or comment on what has been said. I'm going to start by, because I want to make sure that participants have an opportunity to voice their questions or opinions. And there's a question in the chat from Wolfgang that I'm going to take right away on the seemingly underlying philosophy behind a lot of the approaches that pathways approaches, that pathways will move us towards a more positive direction. And it's true that in the presentations, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that they're dealing with contested interests, contested values, that the process is uncertain, the outcome is also uncertain. And so I guess the question is whether the conceptual frameworks that you are using account for this uncertainty, that perhaps the pathways will evolve in a way that might not be as positive as desired originally. Bruno, Andreas, I see that you're keen to start tackling this this question. Bruno, maybe you can start.
I can start, yeah. Thank you, Wolfgang, for this very interesting question. I think from what I know about the application of adaptation pathways is that they have been able sometimes to deal with the lack of consensus in terms of values, but also a lack of agreement in terms of knowledge, but not really in terms of how you make decisions, who decides, and so on. So I often like to analyze decision context in terms of values, rules, and knowledge. So values in the sense of what we want, knowledge in the sense of what we know about the outcomes of a decision, and rules about who decides, what are we allowed to do, and so on. So in some example of adaptation pathways, like in Australia, in a coastal area, the situation was a completely lack of agreement with respect to the risk, the preferences for the benefits and the cost of action, differences in terms of hope for the future. So there were divergences everywhere. And with a process of building adaptation pathways, the result that the stakeholders reached a consensus about what adaptation could look like. So I think in this case, the disagreement about what we know and what we want was kind of addressed by the process. But when there is a very different perception on the rules, like for instance, who should act, should be a top-down or bottom-up processes, when there are conflicts between different political processes, I think in this case, the adaptation pathway may have much more limitation. So it's my feeling that for values and knowledge, that's fine, but for disagreement on rules, it's more difficult.
Thanks. Andreas, maybe you wanted to add also your perspective on this topic.
Yeah, also short addition from my side. The model that we are using is very abstract, and it only shows biophysical implications of changes that might occur in scenarios. I think it's a bit distinct from the other approaches, but it can inform them. And it can so because what we do is focusing on some future trajectories in this case, or in our case, in the agri-food system. And then we see, okay, this change or the other change may help to transform or to reduce, for example, greenhouse gas emissions or other implications, environmental implications. But if you turn that around, you can also say, okay, what are then the contributions that lead to higher or to more negative environmental implications? And I think identifying those is then something that can subsequently inform transition pathways or adaptation pathways. So even though we're not specifically focusing on that, I think especially in this options-based approach, you can find scenarios that are completely unsustainable, but then you identify and then you can see, okay, what are the main factors that lead to unsustainability in such scenarios.
Thanks, Andreas. Niki.
I want to add 2 points here. First, to respond to Wolfgang's comment about whether all these pathways, they always end up in a positive future. I think this is also the main proposition, that at least from a strategic planning perspective and from a transition management perspective, are pathways to an anchor point, and this anchor point is a co-created desirable vision. Of course, lately with this whole policy and science narrative on mission-oriented innovation, you say, okay, it's kind of a broader mission that these pathways can respond to as well. So yes, you as planning devices, as planning tools, pathways are to create these conditions, these institutional changes that are required so as to achieve a better state of a system in the future. At the same time, we are aware that you might also have undesirable pathways taking off and emerging. And this is what we see very often exactly as maladaptation pathways and the maladaptation space. Also, the presentation of Bruno and Sandra showed in a diagram the maladaptation space. Sometimes you have pathways taking off there, but also the path dependencies can create or block pathways and a strategic action towards more desirable futures. There is where we need a more interdisciplinary collaboration as well, not only to evaluate and adapt, but also to question and to examine the options, the different solutions, different actions within these pathways. And there comes my second point, that pathways are not apolitical, but at the same time, they do address, in the majority, at least the projects that I was involved, also institutional dimensions. So yes, they do talk about the aspects of policy change, of institutional change that need to happen in order to achieve transformative climate adaptation. And also the pathways that we have seen addressed or pointed at with the IPCC reports. You can see that they are mentioning a lot of dimensions of institutional change. So institutional change is part and can be part of actions incorporated and presented within pathways.
Thanks, Niki. And as Sandra remarked in the chat, there are already a number of unsustainable pathways that have been identified. In fact, probably the one we're currently on for the most part could be considered unsustainable. I don't know, Sandra, if you wanted to expand on this, on the fact that perhaps it's worth taking a chance in trying to find alternatives to our current pathway.
No, I would rather let Wolfgang first speak, because he raised his hand. Yeah, because I think he's going to talk to this, among other things.
Yes. Yeah, no, I don't want to derail this discussion most of all, because I think that the pathways work that has gone on is taking place on exactly the planning scale, spatial planning scale, I suppose, much of it that you all have presented very well, and I don't want to raise any doubts about that. I'm just expressing my personal frustration that we're looking for transitions and transformations at the more international scale and also the national scale, not just for climate, but also for biodiversity, of course. And we are just against these incredibly powerful forces that are not actually coming to the table, so that you can have deliberative processes and anything reasonable where you like talk to each other respectfully and all these things that I think the pathways community has probably cultivated. So I just needed to express that and probably maybe there will be a corner of transformation research where we can develop this further, but probably not directly in this initiative. So let's perhaps come back to the more concrete things that have been suggested in the presentations.
Adrian, you would like to react to this as well?
My reaction is really to Wolfgang's original question in the comments, and I've replied with a comment, but I think that a lot of our work starts with the assumption that powerful interests, whether those are government or government working alongside very entrenched industries, don't agree on a particularly sustainable path, and their main focus is on perpetuating the existing power dynamics and, in many cases, their business models. So it would be really interesting if there were people who had used pathways in a kind of planning, as a planning metaphor or tool, to map out, and especially to actually, if they've seen such interests or such businesses be destabilized and actually broken down, because that's what we really need. And I mean, it's very, very difficult to imagine, I think, powerful actors within government knowingly setting out that destabilization of, say, the fossil fuel industry. But if there are colleagues who've worked on that and seen some positives, it would be really interesting to hear.
Yes, Sandra, please go ahead.
I definitely don't have an answer, but this is actually the more broadly the question I wanted to ask to our panelists and anyone attending this seminar today, which is regarding the planning perspective. I was wondering whether there is already some evidence and some hindsight on how some pathway-based planning processes have unfolded and what their major achievements and potentially limitations have been.
Just to make sure, Sandra, are you asking if we want to bring a real example that the pathways approach went from planning to get through council approval, through becoming implemented, through becoming policy evaluated? And
to having brought change as a last step. So not only implemented, but is there evidence, and I recognize, including in the work that we've been doing, that the approaches are quite recent, but is there evidence for the actual impact of pathway-based approaches, participatory pathways and otherwise?
Well, I can offer a number. I can offer one, I can start with one from the city of Aberdeen, all the way in Scotland. We were working with a number of cities in a consortium of a project back at Utrecht in Erasmus University in the Netherlands called Music, and Aberdeen City, together with a lot of renewable energy stakeholders, community organizations, schools, and the universities there. We did a full transition management cycle and co-created a set of pathways. One of these pathways was about how we attune our education systems for a future away from fossil fuel industry or fossil fuel dependent futures for job creation in the city of Aberdeen. And that created a dialogue and a collaboration between the different universities, the University of Aberdeen, James Hutton Institute, a number of schools and other education organizations in the city. If I'm not mistaken, 5 to 6 years after we have been discussing and after the co-creation of these pathways as part of this process, James Hutton Institute together with Aberdeen University, they really went through a curricular change. They created more master programs, and they renewed also their bachelor programs and research programs to go more towards green jobs, towards more sustainability science programs, and started very slowly into changing and deregulating the programs that they relate and fuel only professionals and educate professionals for the fossil fuel industry. And I only found out because actually they presented that if you are to look on low carbon futures or no fossil fuels, we also need to make sure that we leave no one behind. And that means that we don't only need to create green jobs, but we need to also think about how we re-educate and reskill people that they work now in the fossil industry, in the oil and gas for the green jobs. And they were presenting, like which type of curricula they created and how the graduates and the reskilling programs have been working in the first years as a result, of these pathways. And I can say that this is an example of how exactly these novel collaborations, these examinations of what type of alternative courses of action we need to take. When you ask, okay, who is the solution? Who can take this up? For whose future are we talking here? that can actually mobilize and empower actors and take action and realize pathways. This is just one example. I have a lot of urban examples for me, but this is one that, as we all know, is very difficult to navigate curricular change and changes within universities. But this became possible exactly because of this collaboration that was inflicted and started through co-creating of the pathways.
Thank you, Niki. I don't know if there are any other comments, reflections based on Sandra's original question. If not, I see that there's another question in the chat that has been asked by Cedric, who is not able to use the microphone. So I'm going to ask the question on his behalf. It seems that in all the presentations, the tipping points are highlighted as a feature along the pathways, whereas they have been rarely demonstrated as occurring in real socio-ecological systems. So Cedric is asking, are you aware of any studies predicting such tipping points and effectively observing them afterwards? And Cedric, feel free to complement the question in the chat if I've missed anything. I don't know if anyone would like to respond to this.
I could just briefly respond to say no, I'm not aware of those kinds of studies. And certainly from the perspective that we've been working from, we haven't been using the term tipping points, but we have been using the idea of transformations and seeing transformations mainly as emergent on the basis of multiple interacting dynamics, which are very, very difficult to understand, let alone predict. So hence the approach of incrementalism and adaptive management adaptation, rather than envisaging a clear pathway to a tipping point which can be predicted.
Thanks, Adrian. Sandra?
Yeah, I would tend to agree that tipping points have little predictability and aren't necessarily the most useful concept and terminology. I would rather talk about crisis and situation of change, and in particular the gaming approaches in all their types. So not only board games, but acting and multiple other approaches are pretty good at not forecasting tipping points, but addressing them in a what-if mode. So, for example, in games, it's possible to propose to players compounded multiple risks or multiple risk extreme events combined with, for example, a certain political or economic context, and this way to identify the actions that will be taken. So it's not about forecasting these tipping points, it's more about getting people to think about how they will respond to these should they happen. And as I very briefly emphasized in my presentation, it's not about learning about these particular tipping points either. It's learning about what to do in a situation, how the people would organize themselves, what they would change to get onto a more desirable pathway.
Thank you, Sandra, for complementing Adrian's response to this question. I see that there's been a couple of comments in the chat addressing the inclusivity of different actors in knowledge, the creation of the co-creation of the knowledge processes, and the fact that perhaps the powerful are sometimes not involved in those processes, maybe because they don't have much to gain from, or that it is risky for them to engage in those processes. And so there's a question from Chloe asking, or perhaps Chloe, if you're able to use the microphone, maybe you can ask the question yourself if you want to.
Thank you. I don't know if my mic will be ideal. I'm actually in a workshop at the moment, so it's not ideal. Yeah, my question, because I mean, it's something very recurrent, and I think Adrian said they have done some work on that. is there's obviously power relations, and power is always, I mean, it's nested power relation is very complicated and complex issue, and I wonder if we engage with the powerful enough to really understand what blocks the transitions, you know, meaning, you know, from a wisdom perspective, you know, I mean, there's vested interest at different scale, personal scale, organizational scale, institutional scale. Even now we see United Nations, they have their own agenda. You know, when you talk about the SDGs with marginalized communities, informal settlements in South Africa, then what are they talking about? So there's power everywhere. And I'm just wondering, what can we learn from those powerful people about how we can take this transition further?
Thank you, Chloe. Any immediate reactions to this big question, Adrian?
Yeah, I think that whilst I wouldn't offer an answer, that's something that we looked at quite deliberately in our transformative knowledge network. And at the beginning of the work, I mean, it built on many years of engagement in each of the hubs, but we actually mapped out the actors in various hubs and tried to assign an evaluation of how powerful they were in terms of obstructing or supporting the potential transformation. And we tried to identify which of those actors were aligned with a more sustainable vision, or aligned with the transformation that we and many of our research partners held, and which of those actors were not aligned, so were most likely to obstruct that. And then we used that as a guide to action and to who we would engage with. In some of the cases, our hubs decided to work directly with powerful actors that were non-aligned from the beginning and try to find some middle ground, but also to map out differences using various methodologies. In some cases, they decided after reflection that it just wasn't working. And so they had to abandon that kind of partnership approach and go for the alternative, more radical action-based approach instead. And in other hubs, we started working with less powerful groups that shared our perspective. But as the momentum from our work and the mobilization grew, we were actually able to draw the more powerful interests in. And so whilst we didn't kind of overturn any huge vested interests, we at least ended up working more alongside them in a more productive way on the basis of, I guess, bringing together a network of aligned actors, even if those were individually less powerful. So yeah, there were lessons either way, but I'm afraid I can't offer an answer.
Thanks, Adrian. And just a question, what was the time frame of your engagements? And is it sustained once you leave? Is really this kind of relationship sustained once you leave?
Yeah, that's really important. And so in each of the 6 hubs, some of the organizations, the universities, or in some cases individuals, had been embedded in those processes for years or decades before our project started. And in fact, that was the case in most of the hubs. In others, they were starting to research more emergent issues, which had really come to the fore in the previous years, in recent times. And in terms of continued engagement, I guess it's been mixed, but the engagement has, in some cases, tapered off, so reduced. But I think in most cases it continues in a different way, or the project enabled some kind of contributions, whether that was knowledge contributions, whether it was convening different processes. In some of the hubs, they've managed to continue that work either with or without funding. And in other hubs, people have just continued as citizens of the area in which they work. But I think this is an issue with all project-based transdisciplinary research or transformative research, that it can, if mismanaged, actually divert processes of transformation that are going on anyway. And in some cases in positive ways. It can shift, it sometimes can shift the balance of power, and then at the end of projects, you can walk away with, at the worst case, actually having made a negative impact. So it's a really good question. We reflect a bit about it in the book, but we were only funded, the project was funded for 5 years, the book came out 2 years later, and these transformations continue.
So there's a need for another book.
I'm not sure if I can handle another one, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian, and thanks, Chloe, for your question. I don't know, perhaps there are other reactions or comments about this question from our panel. If not, we have another question from Sophie, who cannot ask it directly, so I'm going to do it on her behalf. The question is, in co-creation processes, how can researchers communicate the science on climate change and biodiversity crisis in ways that do not demotivate or even paralyze action, and instead inspire positive thinking on transformative pathways into the future? Is this something that has ever occurred to you while working on co-creation processes? Bruno, yes.
Yes, it's a good question. We have had many cases of situations where it was difficult to bring up the science on climate change or biodiversity, because we were in places where people were already struggling with a difficult climate, like in West Africa. And so for us, it was a kind of ethical problem to talk about climate change scenarios. So I agree that it's quite difficult. And it's also difficult when we try to stimulate the imagination of stakeholders. We had this experience in the Alps that when we were talking about pathways, people were tending to think of their business as usual, or maybe what they would do in 5 years, but not trying to imagine very different futures. So in trying to stimulate the imagination of stakeholders, we are pushing them to imagine sometimes negative futures. So this process can be quite disruptive, can create negative emotions, distress. And so I think there are very important ethical questions when we talk of dystopian pathways with stakeholders that already face difficult situations.
Thank you, Bruno. Niki.
Well, thanks, Sophie, from the question. It's a common question. Well, you cannot hide the truth, right? We all know that if we go above 3.5 degrees or the 6.5 scenario of our RCP, it doesn't look very good. So bringing the science of climate change and biodiversity loss into communities needs first a scoping element in terms of understanding which level of awareness they have, which level of ecological knowledge, and what would be the best medium. In the workshops we did in Hungary, for example, the team there employed a designer, and they did it via visuals. What would be the more powerful visual to present a scenario of how Hungary and a specific region very well recognized will look in a 6.5 degrees average increase of temperature globally, based on scenario work. So the engagement with artists was very powerful. The visuals actually helped. They said the story more vividly. Yes, it was a doomsday presentation, but I have to say it also created a sense of urgency, and a sense, instead of a paralysis, more a sense of urgency of we need to take some action, and we need to also think about what actions we can take now. In another setting, when we had the European, the regional policymakers together with social actors, and in another workshop, what again through arts, they created 4 tables of 4 different climate change futures and what would be the available food. So we try to touch the climate science through an everyday experience, how it would look, which type of water and how much water would be available, how your food would look like, the availability, and also presenting the different sides of the table as different sides of the geography, you know, what the global south versus the global north will have available in different climate scenarios. There are different ways that you can present the science. You can go very technical, or you can also use the performative, the creative arts to help on that. So yeah, we have examples. I can absolutely share if you want after the seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki. Andreas.
Yeah, just to add here, I think you can also not, or you should also not kind of avoid to discuss about things that are happening. But I think it's important to kind of to map out the room to maneuver that you have. And this also concerns what I discussed in the beginning, like the temporal and the spatial mismatches or matches between the models that you use as a scientist, but also then the stakeholders you are interacting with or you're communicating to. And then I think it kind of it allows to develop a sense for where can I act and where not. And I think this is something where you can then kind of enable or not try to lead to kind of doomsday and that people cannot do anything. But I think it's very important, just to conclude, to really address the temporal and the spatial scope in which you can act.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left for this session. And I would like to invite any of the members of the panel to perhaps share some reflections that they have had in being in not really confronted, because it was not really confrontational, but in presence of different approaches, what that inspires, whether they see avenues for more collaborations, cross approaches, whether there are actually fundamental differences between approaches or not. Maybe it's mostly an academical debate. But yeah, I just wanted to see if you have any closing thoughts to share with us.
Okay, just to break the silence. I have to say that what I liked from today's presentations and also from the discussion we just had is the realization that we do need to put our faith, but also our time on collaborative action and coordinated action. And this collaboration between scientists, stakeholders, civil society, and any type of entrepreneur or social actor that can mobilize and bring action for transformative change to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss is very important. But at the same time, I think we all show how complex it is, and that we are not naive, that they come with limitations, that they come with intensity in terms of time, investment, reflecting the positionality of research. but at the same time be brave, if I might say, and take up this course of transdisciplinary transformative research. So if I can summarize it in some way. So that's on my side.
Bruno.
Final word, I would say that I would repeat that pathways are a powerful metaphor, and it's not a magical approach or method. So it depends on how we use it, how we use the metaphor. So in addition to the metaphor, we need plenty of skills, especially when we work with stakeholders to develop pathways. So those skills are the skills that we know for any participatory process, including how to navigate power asymmetries, how to deal with the emotional part of the process, as we said before, with the distress that may be caused by some visions of the future. So I think pathways are a nice metaphor, but we need a lot of other skills or tools to develop them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Sandra?
Complementing the views that have already been expressed, I would express perhaps a wish. I think pathway approaches will be fully successfully unrolled when they're actually carried by non-scientist groups, decision makers themselves. And we heard about citizen groups from one of Niki's example. And so in that case, our role would be to build these capabilities to unroll pathway approaches, including all the skills that Bruno mentioned, and come in as supporting these processes rather than initiating them. And I see that there's some way to that.
Thank you, Sandra. Andreas?
Yeah, I just want to add a quick comment. So just want to add that especially in this interdisciplinary collaboration between scientists that work on different scales, but also from different disciplines, so natural and social science is essential to kind of adequately tackle the complex and the intervolved crisis that is happening at the time. Just as a short comment at the end.
Thanks, Andreas. And Adrian?
Thanks. Absolutely excellent points from everybody. I guess I would, thinking about, I guess there are tensions between these different approaches, but there are also real synergies and possibilities to learn from each other. I think Bruno's point about it's important how we do this work. It's not just the methods or the approach, but it's how we conduct ourselves as researchers. And I think that the idea of handing over so that more of this work is led by communities rather than researchers is really also excellent. I think that there's a debate to be had about how research funding and the science system enables that and how much it actually incentivizes researchers to keep hold of these projects rather than handing over and embedding themselves within transformation processes that are already underway.
Thank you, Adrian. And thanks everyone for making this session really thought-provoking and stimulating and I think very useful. So yeah, special thanks to our speakers today, Niki, Adrian, Sandra, Bruno, and Andreas. This has been a pleasure for me to host this session, and I hope that everyone who participated had as much stimulation as I did. If you would like to watch the recording of this session or share it with other people, if you would like to watch previous forums that we've organized, be sure to visit our Pathways webpage. Links will be provided in the chat any second, or maybe there already have been. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on the Pathways Initiative activities, you can subscribe to our Pathways Initiative newsletter or follow us on Twitter and Mastodon. I think my colleague Natalie has already provided all this. And lastly, I mentioned it quickly at the start of the session, but for those of you who are not there yet, The Future Earth is organizing an autumn school at the European level later this year in October. It is open to researchers who are early career researchers and based in Europe. If you would like to attend this autumn school on sustainability science, be sure to check out our webpage dedicated to this. And you can also reach out our colleague Rebecca Fenn from the French Office of Future Earth in order to get more information. Thanks again to everyone. And with this, I would like to conclude this forum. And I hope to see many of you in 2 months for our next Pathways Forum. Until then, take care.